Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, depending on which part of the world you're in. Welcome to our monthly series of webinars around early impact assessment. Today, we are happy to have two presentations. The first is from Bioversity.
Lina, you're breaking a little bit.
Bioversity CIAT on climate change adaptation. The innovation is on climate change adaptation, and they will talk to us about how the monitoring and evaluation data can be exploited to work out an impact evaluation strategy. So they will have about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a discussant to help us perhaps refine that strategy a little bit more. And this will be followed by a presentation from IFPRI, which will be made by three of the presenters, Muzna, Swati, and Prapti. And that will also be followed by a brief discussion on how the study can be improved. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Lina Ibarra of Bioversity CIAT, and look forward to hearing about your work.
Thank you very much. So I'll start, right? Yeah, fine.
Right.
Okay, so, well, hello everyone. Thank you for being here and for having me here for this opportunity to share our ideas. Today I'm going to present monitoring an evaluation plan that we have for the project, so for the initiative here in Colombia. And we are going to present some ideas to try to track the intervention that are going to be disseminated during the project in order to think about the design of a rigorous impact assessment. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So first, I want to mention the other two people that I work with, that is Robert Andrade and Carolina Gonzalez. We work in Foresight and Applied Economics team. Carolina is the leader. So, okay. So let me give you some background about the agriculture in Colombia. So the agricultural sector in Colombia is a very important activity in our country. There is about 7 million hectares for agricultural users, and it's about 2.7 million farmers, according to the last census. But Colombia is considered highly vulnerable to climate change, according to many studies. So as we can see in this map, it is expected a high variation in precipitation in almost all the agricultural regions here in Colombia in the future. So this initiative started with a pilot in 2013 that was led by the Ministry of Agriculture and CIAT, with the objective of strengthen the adaptation capacity of the agricultural sector to climate change. The project focused mainly in two crops, that was rice and maize. And the project it was only with research focus and didn't aim to reach the producers directly. However, there were a good lesson learned, like for example, in the among the rice producers. They increased their yields and they were more likely to use agroclimatic forecasts. And this could be explained because the support of the Rice Producers Federation, that is called Federarroz, that increased awareness about climate change. But on the other side, among the maize producers, there were no changes, significant changes in their productivity, and is explained also by the challenges implementation by the Maize Producers Association, like PENALCE. So those differences is very important to take into account in this new phase. And it's very important to highlight the limitation that the impact assessment of this pilot had, that it was the scarce documentation of monitoring data of the intervention. So that's why it's very important in this new phase. So, okay. So now the initiative is scaling. So with the aim to reduce the agricultural vulnerability to climate change, but minimizing the effect of or agricultural competitiveness and producing quality food and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the initiative will be at national scale and will include 9 crops for the next 5 years. And it is expected to reach 219 municipalities, as we can see in the map, and around 180,000 farmers with an investment around $100 million. So as you can see, there is a large number of stakeholders in this initiative. So there have been around 150 professionals developing the initiative proposal. So it's a very important number. And okay, so this project is going to have 3 main components. And 2 of these are those who are going to generate the technologies, the first one and the second one. And the first one is digital agriculture and climate services, with an emphasis on adaptation and mitigation. And this will be a tool to provide farmers information that facilitates the improved decision making through big data tools or climate risk information and recommendation for the farmers to crop management. And also we have the second component, that is genetic improvement, crop management techniques. And this includes the 2 subcomponents also. There is improved varieties or massive multiplication of seeds of some crops, and also the low carbon and water management techniques for increased resilience. And we also have a third component, but this acts transversally to the other 2. So this is responsible to ensure that all the information that is going to be generated by the other 2 reaches the producers and other actors in an efficient way. So here I'm going to present a little bit part of the theory of change to give an idea of how the initiative can generate the impacts. So we expect to have outputs like extension training workshops, digital platform for recommendation of crop management, and validated cropping practices. And with these outputs, we expect to have these outcomes like technical assistance with climate information services, farmers that use recommendation for the crops, and also the uptake of farming systems that can reduce gas emissions. So all of these to achieve the impact and improve well-being through greater productivity and sustainability practices. Now I would like to share our plans for monitoring the initiative and assess the impacts. So we are going to implement a standard monitoring system that is required by the funders and consists in 4 main points. The first one, we want to mapping the intervention by component and crop. Then we will create a data storage platform, and we are going to complement our analysis with focus groups and monitoring pilots. And also we have a reporting system that is semi-annually and annually reports. So as you can see in the graph, this indicates the standard monitoring system. These we have examples of the monitoring indicators that we are going to collect. So here's, for example, we will record the number of farmers trained by gender or disaggregated by institution and crop. We also have the number of farmers receiving agricultural services or number of demonstration plots, or etc. And these are based on the proposed activities of the company. But besides the monitoring, we are also designing the impact evaluation of the initiatives. So far we are considering three levels. That is micro or household level, also meso or organizational level, focusing the producers or organizations. And we also have been thinking on macro level in terms of the influence on policies related to climate change. So we are also planning diverse data collection exercises. So we are going to collect 3 household surveys. There is baseline, midline, and headline. These include all crops, and it's going to be related with the timing of each crop and with the activities. And also we are going to collect representative samples to do our analysis. We are also going to complement our quantitative evaluation with a qualitative. There is going to be through focus group with farmers and producers association. We are also thinking about search of secondary databases, or complementary data collections. And also we are discussing with the other research groups on how to measure different types of outcomes like deforestation, adoption, resilience. So we are in this now. We are going to collect some indicators. One of them, many of them are suggested by the funders. So, like the hectares of land or forest under improved and effective management that contributes to reduce the emissions, or numbers males and females that are benefiting from the adoption or diversity. And these that are suggested by the funders, we are going to complement it with others that we have thinking. That is like the number of farmers who consult a climatic forecast of the area of the area for crop decisions, or number of technicians using the information that they receive. So we are we have thinking on this. But we are also, besides the standard monitoring and evaluation, we are also want to expand the way that we want to implement the impact evaluation and use the data on the project. So all of this in order to design a rigorous impact assessment. So we have traditionally we have implemented impact evaluation of about the innovations, using a standard comparison from adopters and not adopters, or maybe if the person participate or not participate. But with the experience we are aware that this could bring many challenges. For example, because the adoption of participant in a project is an individual decision, it's a personal decision. So this could bring that we may be not able to have a valid counterfactual, and at the end we can do a invalid inference of the impact of innovations. So to improve our analysis, we want to explore an alternative approach and incorporate the information that we are going to collect during the monitoring to design an impact evaluation. So we have discussing with other teams or with the other people for ideas, and also we are following Goaling and Boulder goals that, for example, They use data on time and space variation in the diffusion of varieties to measure the impacts on their variables. So we want to do something similar. So we believe that we had a great opportunity and an advantage to design the monitoring and evaluation data before the project starts. So we still have to identify additional outcome variables for measure the impacts, but now we have this idea. So with this, we want to do what we want to do is to look for sources of exogenous variation, spatial and temporal, and better measure to the impacts that the project hopes to achieve. So we aim to design monitoring to know what, when, and where the project activities are disseminated and promoted, and we will focus in digital agriculture with and climate services. There is the component 1, and the 3 crops, that is temporary crops like rice, corn, and potato. We need to do this, we need to expand the indicators to be tracked. So we'll focus in those that can help tracking dissemination activities and in those indicators that are related to the activities in the farm. So we will locate it spatially and temporally the intervention of the project, answering the what, when, and where. So for example, we want to know for that indicators what type of intervention was disseminated, when it was disseminated, and where. That is in the village, municipality, or department that was exposed to the intervention. So these are the 3 questions that we are going to answer with our indicators. And additionally, we want to plan to capture information on how the farmer understands the technology or information too. So for that, we have been thinking to create an assessment instrument to know two types of information. One is the perception of whether the person increased their knowledge and if they will apply it, because it's very different if you go to for example a workshop, but if you don't want to apply the knowledge in your farm. And the other type of information that we are going to collect with this is general knowledge. And so, for example, if the person understand the concepts or the idea of the training or course or workshop. So far we have identified some outcome variables for the impact evaluation. So we have some variables. As usual, crop yields will be an outcome variable. So also to complement that, we are going to collect data on an intensity of the intervention that includes input assets, input use of the an asset, water management, pest management, and all of these information that are site-specific recommendation from the professionals. And we will also like to monitor a sowing date to see if the farmers are following one of the main project recommendations from the component 1. So we are going to do this at the household level through our surveys, and also we are going to do the analysis at the municipality level. So with the secondary data that we will have. Another outcome variable that we have thinking is about the sowing date. So we want to monitor whether farmers are following the recommendation of sowing date that will be based in climate forecasts. This is from the component 1 also too, and we want to record the intensity of exposure to this recommendation and climate forecast. So we are planning to collect this data in our household surveys, but we also want to explore another source of information on another methodologies. So we want to explore the remote sensing And we have been thinking to interact with remote sensing colleagues, whether we can also use satellite images and vegetation index for different agricultural seasons. So we want to know, and we want to explore if we can identify some crops in a specific date to determine the sowing dates. So it's something that this could be very interesting. And another important idea that we have exploring is how to measure greenhouse gas emission. So to have this variable, we use a method that we are exploring that combines two variables. That is emission factor and activity data. So the emission factor attempts to relate the quantity of a pollutant released to the atmosphere with an activity associated. So for example, in the case of a particular fertilizer, the emission factor is the amount of emission released by the application of 1 unit of the fertilizer. So these values are going to be estimated by other teams of the initiative, especially of the component 2. They generate these values, well, some of these values, through pilot plots. So they are going to differentiate by regions and production systems. And also they are going to evaluate the performance of mitigation practices. So they compare the conventional practices with our improved practices, and in order to have these values. And also we have the activity data, that is the amount of the pollutant used by the farmer. So it's the quantity that a person used, for example, of the specific fertilizer. So this data is collected by surveys, and it can vary depending of each farmer. So the greenhouse gas emission is the result multiplying these two variables. So yeah, there are different variables that need to be collected to do the greenhouse gas emission, and these are those ones. For example, the methodology that our researchers use is using these variables that are like categories, and those are associated with a series of inputs that has been already well documented. So we have discussing this topic with other researchers of the initiative, and they are willing to improve measurements and evaluate if they are suitable for constructing an output variable for an impact assessment. So we want to explore this variable too. So the unit of analysis that will be the greenhouse gas activity factor, that it varies depending on the farmer. And we aim to collect this data from the baseline and then monitor how the intensity of the project can vary the emission through the activity factor. So it will be important to access how sensitive gas emission measurements will be. And with this, we aim to determine whether with this method we could access if activity data could change with the intervention activities. So we can relate those variables. And we are also exploring diverse sources of secondary information, not only our surveys, and this includes data sets from producer associations that they have information about planted and harvested area or yields. And we are also thinking information collected regularly by the Minister of Agriculture and the government of Colombia. And also we want to use some climate databases that are available in Colombia. So yeah, that was our ideas. So that are in a first planning stage, and we are still in the early stage of the design. So we would like to discuss and explore how to measure different outcome variables, like as I already said, like deforestation, adoption, resilience, that it could be very interesting. Well, we have to know how to measure that. Also, we want to improve current capacity to use remote sensing, to identify variables of interest, like planting dates. So we think that we can. It could be very interesting too. We also assess the incorporation of gas emission measurement that might be suitable for impact evaluation, and we need to identify specifically the secondary data sets that we are interested and could have interesting variables. So that was the presentation and our ideas in this first stage. So thank you for the opportunity, and we look forward for your comments or suggestions or ideas, because this could be very, very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina. That was really very clear and lucid. Fascinating work, and a lot of thought that's already gone into setting up monitoring and evaluation systems and integrating the impact as we get started. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rashid, the judge, and have him come in and provide some thoughts and suggestions. Rashid?
Hello, good morning. Can I share my slides?
Yes, please.
Are you seeing it?
Yes, very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me for commenting on this presentation. We only have the slides to comment for, and I think it's because it's still an ongoing project that is. Can you hear me? It's like very silent. Okay. So great. It is one thing is, to me, this is even more than a proposal. I would call it a brainstorming, because it throws a lot of ideas, lots of good ideas that are interesting, that shows a potential for an interesting evaluation. But it's a brainstorming in the sense that you will probably need to make lots of decisions that you haven't made yet, and you're kind of exposing, okay, this is the whole set of options that we have. And you will one of the tasks that you have now is to narrow this into one coherent strategy where you feel you have the various pieces that makes it a solid enough. One of the decisions that you need to make is, do you have to evaluate all the components of CICAP project? It's usually very difficult to try to evaluate the full project at once. Even if you have the monitoring and evaluation for the whole project, it's not obvious that you would want to in a way disperse all your I know, your survey, your efforts, so that you would try to answer everything. That sounds quite difficult to me. Do you need to do it for all crops, or do you want to focus on one crop for which you think you may have a better strategy? And all the components also, I understand there is this kind of technological assistance using the tools, the big data tools. There is varieties. There is a whole set of components. Do you need to assess all of this? Does it come as a package? That will be part of the questions that we'll need to answer. Does it need to be everywhere in Colombia? If you will, for example, if you use a municipality level data, you're probably fine, even if you want to do it everywhere in Colombia. If you have to do survey everywhere in Colombia, obviously that will be very costly. So you really have all these trade-off, and the micro, meso, macro way of thinking could bring you different elements, but I don't think you have to do all of this. It's rather you have to pick between these different options. In some case, maybe combining two of these if you think it really sort of strengthens each other as a strategy. So one, you need to define the treatment in a clear way. I understand there is this digital agricultural extension system. There is climate information services. And not sure whether it's the digital platform or additional climate services that come with it. There is improved varieties with its massive multiplication. So eventually another source of information is where this multiplication comes from, and maybe that comes into the monitoring data that you'll get, the monitoring and evaluation. And there is these sort of low carbon and water management techniques, sort of environmental friendly techniques also, and they're scaling up. So these are very different components. I think it's useful to know, do they come as a package when they say, okay, we will do, even I understand from one of the maps that you showed that it's in various municipalities, they say, okay, we focus more on rice here, on potato here, and various treatment and various crops. But if they focus on one crop, do they bring the whole package at once, or do they just various have different elements? Depending on this, if it's a package training, then you probably have to analyze this as the effect of getting the whole package. If it's separate in each place, then maybe you want to focus only on one or two of these that tend to go usually together. And you also mentioned that you will your strategy looks for sources of exogenous variation. There is simply the treatment starting in this place, what you would call the exogenous variation, or you're actually thinking of getting another source of variation depending on how much you have about the story of how each treatment and where it goes is decided. Obviously, the more you learn about the story of how this works, the better you will be able to define to get some source of exogenous variation. But eventually, in some cases, if you have good, also good time series data about before and after, it could be enough just to, the exogenous variation is knowing that the project starts for potatoes in this municipio, etc. I think it is a strength that if you already have pretty well the monitoring and evaluation, I understand the strength is to start from early on and have a well done monitoring and evaluation so that you have this what, when, and where, I would say who, if you want to add another W in this thing. If you have this well done, that's a good start, because in lots of cases, I think we've had discussions with SPIA where we would like to make some evaluations exposed, but we don't have this what, when, and where. So it's actually really useful if it's well defined. You need to have a precise strategy. It's not easy, even if it sounds like just a monitoring task. It's not easy. So again, do you need to focus on just some of these aspects, connecting it well with what your impact evaluation will be afterwards? Can you have this just well enough, or do you want to have it for everything? Just anticipate that it's not easy, because so many times people don't know we have 2,000 beneficiaries, but you have no idea where the beneficiaries are, etc. So it really, doing this carefully ex ante is an important task in itself. Yeah, and it really has to track the inputs, the take-up of these things, not just the inputs of the project. I mean, in a theory of change kind of inputs, the take-up and the mechanisms also, whenever it's possible to track some of these outcomes. I guess this will be important as well. I think that the theory of change that you have, it's obviously something short for the presentation, but sometimes it really needs to be more precise in terms of, when I was trying to think of what the mechanisms will be, and usually the theory of change helps you with this. But for example, when you have climatic recommendations, I understand sowing date is one of these. You adapt to climate change and sowing at a better time. But really, and so this is one small intervention. What else goes into this? What kind of information allows for what better decisions, and how these better decisions bring? So sowing date is one good example, but at the end, is it only the sowing date that will really be the improved decision, or what other decisions will be improved? So that if you want to track them one by one and think, like sowing date is a good example, you think, how can we measure it? Even remote sensing data can help me measure this kind of thing. It's not easy, but it's feasible. Yeah. So really, more precise theory of change will help defining the variable, defining the mechanisms, and at the end, deciding which data is best to get these mechanisms well captured. On the reducing gas emissions, I must admit that I felt like it was a general definition of how to reduce gas emissions, but it's not clear to me even more what in the theory of change, what are the changes that would be implemented precisely. Second, are these changes, so why the farmers would adopt this? We know that this is the kind of changes that has a lot of positive externalities, but it's not always clear what is the benefit for the farmer. So if you think that the farmers may adopt these kind of practices, is it in itself profitable for the farmer? And on top of this, there is a positive externality, and they just need to know about these good practices, or what else, right? So we are, there is a whole, I think because of it was more of a brainstorming. I think the best that I can bring is questions, thinking that if you get answers to most of these questions, hopefully that also helps kind of put you on a better path for getting more precise impact evaluation. Then you need to choose your main data sources, and define the counterfactual, whatever the counterfactual is, even if it's those that will be treated later. And there is some challenges, because sometimes at the time when you start, especially if you want to have a baseline survey, sometimes you don't even know who will be treated yet, and you don't know who will be the counterfactual. So it's important, the more you can have these plans that are clearly set up ahead before starting, that will definitely be useful. And I don't know how much discussion you actually have with the implementer in order to have this rollout clearly defined. That would be ideal, of course. It seems like it won't be a random intervention. So ideally, you want to have some time series that helps you check the parallel trend and say, okay, if you use the municipality level data, for example, I know there is this kind of a municipality year crop level data. I have a student who did his master's thesis using this kind of data. The downside of it is it is a bit of guesstimates. It's not clear how they are made, but they kind of ask some local extension or expert are saying, okay, what was these level of production more or less for these crops? It seems like it is a bit approximate, but there is no way to get a crop year data collected actually measuring production for Colombia. So that's as good as it gets. In fact, my student got decent results when he used these data. So maybe it makes sense, but you need to be careful about the data, and it will need some checks if you are relying on this kind of data in Colombia. But that's potentially a good source of data, and it allows you to go back in time and allows you to have this time series. So I think that helps get you a bit more confident. Obviously, there will be concerns about why are some places selected for being treated and others not, and why they're doing potato here but rice here. Maybe they thought that the potato farmers here had more potential and the rice farmers had more potential. So you would need to think about how to manage all this. And if you have this level of data, that gives you these time series to be more confident about this, and convince the reader also the analysis afterwards that they are comparable, or realize that they're not comparable at least. Producers' organizations data can be rich data. It has a good potential, but that requires narrowing the outcome. But I would definitely invest this with the keeping in mind the possibility of narrowing this to, if you know that for a subset you have good data, then maybe it's worth focusing on that subset. Then there is the remote sensing is also a good potential, but it's a lot of work, and it's all of this is a bit on the edge of time on. Have to pick which ones once the channels are better defined and you have all these additional elements of it, information. And the survey data obviously is great because it's more specific outcomes and more specific farmers, but it's costly, it's hard to do everywhere in Colombia, and it won't provide you the time series going backward in time to make sure that you have this kind of parallel trend, given the problem of selection of the places that are treated that you will have. So it's important. So it may need to be completed with the rest. And you can think also of the survey data as a way of checking some of the other data, as a way of calibrating the remote sensing measures, for example. In that case, make sure it is collected in a way that will allow these purpose. And these, you will need to define these clearer counterfactual, I think, whatever the method is. It could be those that are treated later, as long as you can know ahead of time who they are, or depending on which data you use. Okay, And finally, the important thing is that all these pieces are very well integrated. You need to adapt all these elements between themselves. If you use municipality level data, you need to think of a treatment that is intense enough at the municipality level. If you think that within each municipality, maybe 50 farmers are treated out of 20,000 farmers, it doesn't make sense to to work with municipality level data when the treatment is not intense enough to really change the level of potato production yield, whatever outcome is within the municipality level. So it needs to be a good match. If the treatment is much more few individuals here and there, then you do need to have individual level data, either through surveys or through remote sensing once you have localized the persons. But the most, because you offer lots of options, at the end what you pick in one side and the other side really need to match between these different elements, I would say. And that's probably a key element. If you use a remote sensing, yeah, if you will use remote sensing data in the example that was giving, make sure you collect the coordinates at some point in the monitoring. So it's just this good match. You cannot just do the monitoring and afterwards specify the strategy, and then you will realize that you're lacking some of these elements that are required for these strategy. If it's one producer's organization, then you do need to make this focus from the beginning on all the monitoring and evaluation that goes with this kind of crop and this kind of, these, and believe you have an intervention that is strong enough so that you may see some results on that thing. So I would say these are the steps ahead. I think there is great potential and still a lot of space for creativity and getting this rigorous evaluation on food. Thank you. Sorry if I lasted longer than I should.
Very comprehensive. Thank you, Rashid. I would like to turn it up, open to the participants to see if they had some comments and suggestions. We could just spend a few minutes taking those, and then I'll give it to you, Lina, to maybe respond, although you don't have to. You may want to take that offline, but I'll at least give you that opportunity. But before I do that, are others, other participants would like to say something, please? I think we can allow you to just unmute and ask.
So thank you, Rachid, for the feedback. It is super good, all that you said. And yes, it is very important to us because we are in a first stage. And yeah, you're right. Maybe it's a project that is very big and cover a lot of crops. So we have to in this point we have to select what we can do. So yeah, we need to, for example, we need to do the evaluation. We need to do the standard evaluation, but that is required for the donors. So that's we are thinking in meso in household level, a micro level, because it's something that is required in the project. But we are also we have thinking in that concern, because maybe it's too much, maybe it's a lot of crops. So that's why we want to focus in some crops to do an additional work. So it's a very important task that we have to do in these months before the project starts. And thank you for all of that. We are going to have it into account. I don't know if maybe Carolina or Robert want to say something about it.
And while Carolina, hello Carolina, while she unmutes, I just also want to say that there is in the chat box a comment from Karen saying that you need another W, namely Y. In other words, as part of the plan for both monitoring and evaluation, and then eventually impact, try and understand why the different components of the intervention are being rolled out in different places at different times. Potato versus other places, etc. So just know why different components of the package are, I think, given different weight in in different
Yeah,
countries.
yeah, it
Yeah?
will be
Excellent.
very useful, the why and the who that Rashid say, because yeah, there are going to be a lot of activities of the during the project, and we want to know why is doing that in order to try to track that info in that intervention. So thank you, Karen.
Carolina, would you like to say something?
No, I only want to thanks for all of the suggestions. We will take them into consideration for the final design of the evaluation. We want to continue in touch with you and explain of the methodology, and thank you.
Okay. So thanks, all of you, Lina and Rashid in particular. I think I will now turn it over to, are we ready, Muzna, can we start your presentation? I'll now turn it over to the IFPRI, who will tell us about a phone survey that was conducted to try and understand an IPM and related interventions. So I'll turn it over to, I guess, to
me.
Who's first?
Muzna. Me, I'm starting first.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now, and please let me know if you can see it. Okay.
Yes,
I hope
well.
everyone can. Okay, good. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our presentation. I'm Muzna Alvi. I'm a research fellow at IFPRI, and I'm joined today by my co-authors Prapti, Barooah, and Smriti, Saini, who will be making this presentation with me. We're going to talk to you about an RCT on phone-based extension that we conducted last year during the pandemic in Nepal. And we'll try to focus a little bit more on sort of the methodological implementation challenges we faced, what could go wrong and what all did go wrong for us, and some preliminary results from our analysis. So a bit about the study. The study was conducted under CISA, which is the Serial Systems Initiative of South Asia. It's a consortium of 3 CGIAR partners, CIMET, IRI, and IFPRI. And IFPRI carried out this experiment to assess the effectiveness of phone-based extension approaches in enhancing farmer knowledge on fall armyworm, as well as on sort of broadly on integrated pest management solutions. This was not supposed to be a phone-based intervention. We were in talks with Digital Green to develop videos on fall armyworm, and we were supposed to assess the efficacy of videos disseminated in group-based settings, supplemented with phone and traditional methods of extension. And then COVID happened, and we had to pivot. Postponing this experiment was not an option. Fall armyworm was an urgent and emergent threat to maize crop in the region. And indeed, we found nearly 80% of our farmers reported fall armyworm attack during the course of our study. So we had to really adapt. So we collected information as part of this survey, the baseline survey and the endline survey. We also collected information on the impact of COVID-19 on farmers' livelihoods, ag extension access, farm input accessibility, and other economic impacts. The study was conducted in Dang district, which is a district in the province 5 of Nepal, an area bordering India, and it's heavily dependent on inputs from India, both through formal and grey market channels. So including pesticides, they come through India. We partnered with IIDS for surveys, and Viamo for implementing our IPR. We were fortunate to have got a chance to do in-person household listing of maize farmers in early 2020, just before the lockdown happened. And through this, we obtained basic demographic details, information on whether they were members of groups and cooperatives, and what their plan and timeline was for maize planting, because we wanted to make sure we reached them before they started planting. Nepal, and especially areas like Dang, are unique because they have very high rates of out-migration of men, especially to India. And this means that women represent a high number of primary ag decision makers. And in our case as well, 70% of our sample was made up of women who were either primary or secondary ag decision makers in their household. And why that is relevant to implementation will become a bit clear in a couple of slides down. So we had our baseline between May to June, and our intervention was rolled out almost parallelly and went up till July. And then our endline survey was done right after harvest in August, September. We covered about 2,700 farmers in the baseline, and we lost about 15% of our sample to attrition. So we covered about 2,300 farmers at endline. So a bit about our experiment design. We had a clustered randomized control trial, which randomization was done at the village level to minimize spillovers. we had 2 treatment arms, 1 control. The first treatment arm received an auto-recorded IVR voice call, which provided them information on fall armyworm management, identification, scouting, mitigation, as well as 4 weekly SMS reminders, providing the same information again and timed to kind of correlate with where they were on their planting timeline. The second treatment arm received the same information that the people on IVR received, but this time this was done through a phone call by a trained enumerator. So we trained a bunch of enumerators from IIDS on the same information. We tried to make sure that they memorized this information so that there were no quality, no sort of variation among enumerators, and the same information that was provided under IVR, but this time it was provided by a real person making a phone call. These messages, the content of these messages was developed in collaboration with the Nepal government task force on fall armyworm, and also supplemented based on our own team's fieldwork in the region to identify what are the suite of sort of pesticides and other mitigation strategies available to farmers in that region. And we also draw on some of the work that CIMIT was doing in Bangladesh in the previous season on fall armyworm. So this is really sort of a good example of cross-collaborative research with other CG centers as well as working with government agencies. Of course, our control arm had got no information. They were status quo of whatever existing government and private sources of information were already available. That was maintained. They received no additional information from us. Now moving on to what were the methodological challenges. So a bit of background, we collected our data using Survey CTO, which is a platform that allows both remote data collection as well as tablet-based data collection. Survey CTO is not unique. There are several other platforms now which have similar features. We use something called CATI, which is a computer-assisted telephone interviewing, and this enables enumerators to use the same device for data collection and making phone calls simultaneously. Survey CTO has this neat kind of case management features that enables enumerators to track respondents across multiple phone attempts, as well as to reschedule interviews through an automated process. This does require back-end work by those who are coding the survey. So in our case, IFPRIs were doing that coding, but it greatly streamlines the interview process and makes it and minimizes the errors to a large extent. Our surveys were roughly about 40-45 minutes long, which is a bit of a departure from what you hear most phone surveys. They say you should be short, about 20-25 minutes. Our surveys are a bit longer. We don't think that really affected our survey quality. We did all of our enumerator training virtually, multiple training sessions through Zoom and Viber, which is a platform like WhatsApp that's used in Nepal. Of course, everything that you would do in an in-person survey, so mock interviews, pilot testing, all of that was done. We maxed our call attempts at about 7 over a period of 3 to 4 days with a maximum of 2 call attempts per day to reach the respondents. And if after that, the respondent didn't pick up or we were not able to interview them, we moved down to the next respondent in the list. And then a follow-up SMS was also sent in case we had to reschedule, or if the respondent asked to reschedule, if there was no response, and that was also sort of built into the platform. So before getting into the results, I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges we face when we're trying to reach rural women. And as you can see from the map, there is considerable gender gap in mobile phone ownership and access. And this sort of big gap meant that we had to often reach rural women through other family members, which was quite challenging in some cases, because women were not always present with their spouses or sons who were able to, and they were not able to take the call received on their husband's mobile phones or their son's mobile phones. Finding a convenient time was challenging. If the men of the house were at work in the field during the day and women were in the house doing chores in the evening, then it was challenged to find a time when you could get women to answer. And in many cases, we found that family members were not willing to just give the phone to the women in the house to answer the survey. So that was a challenge for us in Nepal. But having done similar phone surveys in other parts of South Asia, especially in India, we realize now that it was significantly less of a challenge in Nepal as it was, for example, when we did similar surveys in Gujarat in India. We acknowledge other biases in our sample as well. We were obviously less likely to reach older, poorer women and men who are less likely to have phones. There were also some other issues we faced related to privacy. Often it was difficult for the respondent to be in a private space when answering the survey. We found early on that some women were required to use speakerphones so that others may be hearing their conversation. We don't know why their phones are on speaker. We know from anecdotal evidence from fieldwork we've done in India that a lot of times men and mothers-in-law ask women to put their phones on speaker so that they can hear what questions are being asked and what answers are being given. And so that could affect response to sensitive questions. And we find, for example, when we do data analysis from other countries, that it does affect answers to sensitive questions, especially those that relate to intra-household decision making. So yeah. Around 24% of our respondents had their phone on speaker, but there's no difference in this between men and women. So men were equally likely to have their phone on speaker as women, at least in this sample. But knowing this is important so we can avoid asking questions where having the phone on speaker introduces response bias to sensitive questions or jeopardizes the safety of women in any way. So not in this survey, but in an ancillary survey that was answered by a subset of these same respondents where we were focusing just on gendered impacts. We did not ask sensitive questions about intra-household conflict, for example, if the phone was on speaker or the respondent was not in a private space. So these are just some of the things, something to keep in mind. Determining whether the phone was on speaker also helped us assess how many respondents could have potentially taken help from other people in the background to complete the test, and so things like that. But there could be myriad reasons why people use speakers. It could be that women are asked by family members to do it, like I said, but it could also just be sort of very innocuous reasons. You're multitasking, you want to answer the survey while you're doing household work. There could be network issues or instrument issues that, if your phone is an old phone, you might want to keep it on speaker, crank up the volume so you can hear clearer. We found that there were certain things we did, it would minimize the use of speakerphone. So for example, especially if women were interviewed by female enumerators, that really reduced the incidence of speakerphone use. If we matched enumerators with the same respondents over multiple rounds, we found that that also reduced speakerphone use. So trust is an important sort of thing to work on. I am now going to hand over to Prapti, who's going to take you over through the implementation challenges. Prapti, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Muzna. Moving on to some of the challenges that we faced while implementing the phone survey. So attrition, especially non-random attrition, is a big challenge in panel surveys, and this is typically heightened in remotely conducted surveys. This is because of various reasons, such as people might not want to answer follow-up surveys, their phones might become inactive, or scheduling interviews becomes a challenge, and so on. So therefore, in addition to the fact that not all our listed farmers had phones, we also could reach about 28% of our farmers who had phones or phone numbers during the listing survey. The primary issue here was that about 17% of them did not answer our calls despite multiple attempts. There were another 8% whose phones were non-operational or belonged to a different household. Fortunately, refusal to participate was quite low. Again, between baseline to end line, we lost about 14% of our sample. So these kind of suggest that offering incentives to participants is often very helpful in reducing attrition. Other than that, verifying phone numbers at the beginning of the survey would also help us, arrive at a more realistic sample size. Next slide. Yeah. So the other thing is, in rural areas, network connectivity issues is quite a bit of a challenge, and particularly in the region where our survey was conducted, it is mostly hilly region. So there were quite network it's quite poor. So there was always this possibility of very frequent call drops, which disturbed the flow of the conversation, and therefore multiple call attempts had to be made to complete the interview. And because of this, there could have been also some errors in recording these respondents. So to work around this, we kind of asked the basic demographic questions such as age, gender, occupation, etc., multiple times throughout our data collection period, which is listing, baseline, as well as end line. We didn't really need to because these things don't change over time. And we understand it might have added a bit to our survey duration, but we feel it helped us in identifying any errors that may have been committed in the previous rounds because of connectivity issues or other issues. In terms of when to call respondents, there isn't really a best time. It is very context specific, but it was important to make sure that we had timed our calls in a way that we didn't call at times when our respondents were more likely to be busy at work or engage in household work or care work. So if you see, a majority of our surveys were conducted in the first half of the day. And sometimes we also had to conduct interviews at night, especially during the paddy transplantation season. But like I said, this is again very location specific. For example, in Gujarat in India, where we did gender surveys, respondents preferred if we call them in the later part of the day. So this is again because they were free then, because they mostly worked as day laborers and urban vendors. So an important lesson here is to which we need to keep in mind is that when we hire surveyors for phone surveys, we also need to kind of make sure that they have flexible work hours so that they are able to work around their timings on the basis of when respondents are likely to be free to participate in the survey. Next slide. Sorry. Yeah. The next important aspect was around rapport building, which again, like Muzna highlighted, it forms an important part of a phone survey to establish trust between respondents and enumerators. And this is usually easier during in-person surveys. But we've had a bit of a privilege here. So our enumerators had listed each household physically in March. So our respondents remembered the entire survey and they were more willing to take part in this. Also, again, since 70% of our respondents were women, we hired mostly female enumerators. Another thing that we tried doing which was helpful, was to incorporate critical information from the previous survey in the questions for the next round. This helped in communicating to the respondents that their participation is valued and the enumerators remember what they shared last time. So this kind of strengthened their trust and made the respondents more comfortable. In addition to these, there were also issues related to hearing or languages, considering there are a lot of regional dialects. So because of this, questions often had to be repeated by the enumerators and might have led to an increase in survey duration. But like we discussed, pilot testing and hiring local teams have been very helpful in managing these language issues to a great extent. Then there were other instances where respondents would pass on the phone to some other family member if they could not follow the questions. So we could not really refuse to continue our interview when they passed it on to somebody else. So what we did was that if any other family member started answering the questions instead of the selected respondents, enumerators were advised to note down the details of the other household member and from which point in the questionnaire they started answering, and also check for the availability for future surveys in case of the baseline survey. Next, we go talk about some of the challenges that we faced in implementing the phone-based intervention. So as we discussed earlier, before the pandemic, it was supposed to involve videos and posters, and we modified this to include phone-based extension. Now, like before we even go on to the phone-based extension, one important aspect of operationalizing an phone-based experiment was that, so as per our initial sample size calculations, we needed 15 respondents per cluster, which was village in our case, to achieve the desired power. However, we were constrained by the number of people in each village who had listed their phone numbers or had phones during the listing survey, and then further, like those who could be reached out in our survey. So eventually there were around 50 clusters for which the cluster size was less than 15, and this had some implications on our power calculations. But drawing comparisons between the two types of information, IVR and phone, IVR remains prone to call drops as respondents do not usually listen to computer recorded calls completely. This is evident in our results in the sense that of those who got IVR, only 68% heard the whole message, which indicates overall a lower uptake of IVR. Whereas for phone calls, our enumerators could manage to ensure that everyone heard the message completely. Having said that, phone calls are quite time consuming, both to make the calls and to train the teams to deliver these messages effectively and ensure minimal quality variation across the messages. Moreover, due to some technical issues which could have been fixed if we were able to catch it earlier, I mean, the provider could catch it earlier, almost half of the respondents that we intended to did not receive the IVR message. And by the time we found out, the sowing season was almost over, so we could not really do much about this. Next slide. So keeping these in mind, although IVRs have gained popularity as an agriculture extension information, what we understand was that it may not work in all contexts. An important thing for us was this experience differs for different IVR service providers. So it is important to choose our collaborators carefully. Also, although it is an automated process, it still required close supervision and back checks. Therefore, considering these challenges, IVR might work better as a means of supplemental information rather than the only form of intervention. Now I'll hand it over to Smriti to walk you through our analysis and results.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thanks a lot, Prapti. I will now be discussing some of the preliminary results that we have from our data. And Muzna, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the study aimed to create awareness around this new pest, as you've been told, which is called the fall armyworm. And the worm resembles some other common worms in the area. But the integrated pest management techniques and the control techniques are very different. So if a farmer does not really act on time, she is risking losing her entire crop to the worm, because this worm can eat up the crop in a matter of days. So during the pandemic, farmers anyway had limited access to all inputs, which also included extension sources, so which is where we were trying to bridge that gap. So this worm was first detected in the region in 2019, and its attack was kind of much worse in 2020. So our interventions were bridging the gap that the lack of formal sources had created, especially during the pandemic-induced lockdown. The assessment of the impact of IVR and phone interventions can actually help the policymakers supplement their extension structure when face-to-face training methods are not really feasible and available, which was actually shown during the pandemic. Muzna, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is the worm that we have been dreading for a while now. In terms of the information, both the interventions were administering the same script. And that script included headers such as like, how do you identify the worm? It looks similar to other worms, but there are a couple of pointers that one needs to keep in mind while scouting. And we were also telling them about how often do you scout, how do you scout, what is the right method to scout. Then recording the level of pest in the field. There was also information on the integrated pest management technique that one had to use to counter, sorry, to control the pest in their field, which included a lot of information on pests, spot spraying, pest timing, pesticide timing, and the type of pesticides that one has to use. Could you please move to the next slide, Muzna? So, yes, thank you. Wait, I think there's one more, I think that you've missed out on. Good, the earlier one. Yes, thank you so much. So, yes, as reported, and also Muzna mentioned that about 80% of our respondents had suffered for attack in their maize crop in 2020. And the impact of this crop was reported in form of lost yields, increased input costs since they had to purchase pesticides, and also more labor requirement because they were scouting more often, which is also a good sign that they were scouting more often, but it also in that way it presented increased input costs for the farmers. We also asked the respondents about their information sources pre and post the lockdown. And we do find that their reliance on other farmers and mass media sources had increased. Though the rise in use of mass media can also be attributed to our interventions, which happen to be IVR and phone. Other farmers also, because this is the time during the lockdown when the traditional sources of information were not really available. So farmers were either relying on relatives or neighbors to get as much information as they could on fall or other pests. Muzna, could you move to the next slide, please? So in terms of how were we actually, what is the output of our study? What is the outcome that we're assessing the effectiveness or intervention on? Was we administered a knowledge test in both the rounds, which comprised of 10 questions, and our intervention script answered all of these questions. So the idea here was to assess the impact of IVR and phone interventions on the knowledge retention among farmers. So our outcome variable was whether their knowledge of fall, scouting methods and mitigation methods had really improved over the two periods of time. And in this table that you see, raw scores have been reported on a scale of 10 because there were kind of 10 questions. And the next slide also, we do have few preliminary results, and we do welcome your suggestions on it. Here in this table, we do see that the mean score for the respondents who received the phone intervention saw the highest increase across the two rounds. And in terms of treatment effects, we'll move to the next slide where we do have ITT and TOT estimates. Muzna, could you move to the next slide? Thanks a lot. So you unlike the last table where we were reporting raw scores, we have used weighted knowledge scores here, taking into account the questions which were answered correctly by the highest number of people. So we used a methodology to weigh our knowledge scores based on this one paper that has also been cited on the slide. And in terms of the intent to treat and the treatment untreated effects, we do see a positive significant impact of the 4 intervention on the knowledge outcomes when we control for covariates. So we don't really see it when we do not control for covariates here. And in terms of specifications that we've tried out, here we're regressing the difference in the baseline and endline scores on the treatment variables. We are in the process of trying other specifications like simply regressing endline scores directly on the instead of the differences on the treatment, as well as accounting for the baseline score. So in the process of refining these specifications, we're trying to make our results more robust. We also plan to do DID regressions and include interactions of the variables we feel will have an impact on this. On the interventions. And in terms of covariates, we control for respondents' gender, age, education, occupation. SMS received, because our intervention of SMS had kind of became botched up by the end of it, and some people received it, some people didn't go at all as we had accounted for it in the design. So that also becomes a controlling variable, and caste. And we also include the variables control for
Has someone lost connectivity?
Yeah, it looks like.
Yes, I think she probably did.
Muzna, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can take over. Yeah, so like Smriti mentioned, we controlled for a whole
Muzna, are you muted by any chance?
We are not hearing her as well.
Prapti, would you like to come in and try and walk us through the remaining slides?
Yes, sure. I just need to move on to the next slide.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, not. Good.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's just bad reception here. Has Smriti joined? I'm not sure. I'm not able to see
yes.
screen. Oh, Smriti, you are there? Okay, you
Yes,
can take over then. Yeah.
For the goof up, it's the internet. Can you move to the next slide, Muzna?
Yeah.
So connecting to where I just kind of dropped out, we were discussing the knowledge outcomes of the intervention, but even in the end line, we did ask them about the adoption rate. So we did ask whether they actually scouted, what kind of pesticides they used, what was the timing at which they sprayed, and what was the area of the plant that they were spraying or aiming at. So these are the things that we tried to capture, and ultimately it is timely adoption which could have prevented farm damage. And in terms of adoption actually of the mixed of the recommended practices, we kind of see mixed results here. And what you see on the slide, these are the results for the respondents who suffered for attack and also received intervention. So control, of course, didn't receive any intervention, but the 2 treatments, IVR and phone, are simply for the people who actually got the treatment, but not like the one who were assigned. But so the sample size is smaller here. In terms of pesticide use, most common controlling measure for was the use of chemical pesticide, and there wasn't as much uptake of biopesticides, which went as a recommendation in the intervention scripts. But another thing to add here would be that a lot of our respondents actually forgot the name or the kind of pesticides they had used. So there is a scope for kind of this bit to change, but whatever data that we have and from whatever our respondents remembered, this is what we see, that most of them reported applying chemical pesticides. In terms of pesticide, the time at which they sprayed and the area at which they were aiming, we do see that higher proportion of farmers in treatment groups adopted recommended spray timing. So they were either spraying very early in the morning or evening. And so is the case for spot spraying, where they were actually, like you do see higher proportion of farmers who received the treatment getting spot spraying right. But instead, what we also see here is that not many farmers actually adopted the practice of spot spraying. So what they were doing, they were instead spraying the whole plant, the whole affected plant, where they were only supposed to spray at the affected areas. So this is a practice which was not really followed by the respondents. Another recommended practice was to record the level of pests that were that infested the field and fall, so that one could decide the type of control measure that would require. The thing is that if fall is at an early stage, the control measures are much different than if the fall armyworm is about to pupate. So it's important to record the level of pest and see the stage at which the pest is. And we saw a very marginal increase in the number of respondents who recorded the level of pests on their field. And so it's that, when it comes to adopting such practices, we need to remember that practices like pesticide use especially are deep-rooted agriculture practices, and these may require more interactive community-based interventions than just IVR and phone-based extensions, and also like a more longer time sustained interventions, which can also be coupled and bundled with the finance and insurance products to ease liquidity and risk constraints, which may arise from the alternatives that we do suggest to pesticides, and the input costs that arise from following the right IPM techniques. So this was the bit on adoption of the practices, is what we see in our respondents. We are in the process of even refining this bit. The analysis has just started, so we do welcome your inputs and your feedback on that. Muzna, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. But this is just some of the lessons that we feel can hold value for the experimental studies. And this is based entirely on our experience, so just condensing whatever's been said. One is that in experimental studies, it's extremely important, sample size is extremely important. So since we are going to stick around with phone surveys, looks like for some time, it's important that one verifies these phone numbers before they actually implement the research design. Because if these numbers are non-functional, then your sample size calculations may just not work out. So it's always a good practice to verify phone numbers at the outset. Then also obtain alternate phone numbers, because sometimes these phone numbers of relatives or neighbors can help you connect to the respondent in case the actual number is not working. Muzna has emphasized enough on this, which is the respondent privacy, and including a question on speaker phone area analysis. So whatever your study and the context it may be catering to, you can always assess whether a question on speaker phone adds to your study. For us, even in our knowledge outcome based study, we ended up including this question in the end line, and we didn't really put it in the baseline, didn't really know this could have been done, but it helped us understand how many people were actually seeking help and how many of the knowledge scores were that way kind of biased. So there is merit to adding that. Then another bit is that you choose your implementation partners wisely. We ended up losing a lot of our sample in terms of how much we reached out to in IVR intervention, simply because of a technical error. So it requires much close monitoring and back checks, as Prapti had emphasized. And then to sum it up, like, the success of both phone-based interventions and IVR is highly context-specific. And phone-based interventions kind of give you a more personalized approach, but they're also very costly and time-intensive. IVR, on the other hand, while it is quicker and it is not that cost-intensive, there are other challenges that IVR interventions face. So it can definitely be used as a supplementary tool to reinforce information that has already been sent out via other modes. So this is it from my end. Muzna, could you move to the next slide? Here are just some of the references.
Oh, okay. You're actually kind of wrapping up. Okay, good.
Yes.
Because we're running out of time. And
Yeah,
I did want to give the apologies for interjecting. Did you actually have a lot more to say, or was this going to be your last?
No, nothing. I was just saying that there's a blog post that I and my colleague wrote on the phone survey issues in phone survey operations, which we wrote for Survey CT4, which you can refer to here. And there's a working paper by Shweta Gupta and Muzna Alvi on specifically on the impact of speaker phones on response bias in phone surveys. So you can also refer to these. So that was it. We can, I think, move to the discussion comments now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I
Thank
guess
you.
I will not take more time and turn it over to Kyle to provide his input.
Okay. Uh-oh. You have to give me a second on. It's not letting me share my screen. Let me try and fix that. I'm not a big Microsoft Teams user.
Ricardo, if not, you could do it and tell Kyle,
Yeah,
because Kyle sent his slides, right?
Yes, I did. Let's do it that way, Ricardo, because it's going to want me to quit Teams, and we're already tight on time. So why don't you throw those slides up there, Ricardo? Sorry, the one time I use Microsoft Teams is for this meeting. Can you see the screen? Yeah, you can go ahead and click, Ricardo. Okay. So thanks so much, Muzna, Prapti, and Smriti. This was a fun paper. It's kind of a really nice study on a new and alternative extension method as direct phone contacts coupled with SMS messages. Quite relevant as more people have phones. And particularly useful during a pandemic when traditional training and visit extension can't work, and moreover, useful to think about as a substitute for that in places where it's hard to reach people via those traditional methods. And my main takeaway from this so far is that phone calls coupled with SMS can do some stuff or move the needle a little bit on information, but it's not quite yet clear about the changes in other outcomes. The slides that I looked at were actually a bit different on the results. So the slides that were sent last week that I read through had different results in them. So I'll have to kind of wing that part of it, but because the results you presented were different. Anyway, let me just give some of my thoughts and suggestions moving forward on the paper. So my first main one here is to start by telling us what information friction your treatment is really addressing. And so I think for us to understand this intervention better, it's going to help if you start by giving us an explanation of how farmers are currently accessing information on these pests, even given the COVID time. So what is the status quo, and what are some of the limitations of that status quo? And these could vary. It could just be limited reach of, say, traditional extension, if that's what farmers are relying on. It could be that farmers don't trust government extension workers. It could be that the content provided by these workers is not appropriate for farmers' local conditions. Or it could be that farmers rely on networks, and these networks are just too sparse, particularly during COVID. And so these are all sort of candidate frictions that could be making the status quo less effective. So starting with a discussion of that and kind of telling us how your treatment targets one or more of these frictions, I think will really help us sort of think through the theory of change and the mechanisms. This second comment is not as relevant. because the numbers that I was shown in the other slides were different than the results that you showed today. So previously it looked like knowledge was decreasing over time. The results you showed today look like knowledge was actually increasing over time. So this can actually be skipped because this comment is irrelevant. So this was my main comment, and it looks like you'd already started to make up some ground here. But you started out by looking at effects on knowledge, and between last week and today had started to include results on uptake or adoption of some of these practices. I think that's where you want to dig deeper and kind of understand a bit, try and understand more or theorize a bit more about why those results are not exactly overwhelming. And the last few slides started to show that the treatment maybe did a little bit in terms of getting people to do spot spraying at a higher rate, even though the base for that is very low. But it also appeared that scouting, if anything, the phone treatment had a negative effect on that. So really kind of understanding those things is important, and sort of moving towards not just those behaviors, but potentially more welfare-related outcomes, such as, say, yield or the severity of tax, would be really important. Because scouting, say, thinking about it theoretically, scouting has some effort cost, and it's not clear how high what is the opportunity cost of doing this scouting. Maybe it's just better for farmers to spray. That's just one potential theory. And looking more at like outcomes and the severity of shocks, we'll get at that. Maybe farmers just spray and that works. And it's just too tedious to be digging around and doing too much scouting. But I think more broadly, really digging deep into the behavior-related outcomes and the more yield-related outcomes and profit-related outcomes would be, I think, where there's a lot of room to keep working. On this one, the fourth one, I'd love to see a more thorough analysis of the first stage. The table in the presentation was quite nice in terms of the rate at which the calls were answered and listened to. I would love to see some description of who were these compliers. That is, what is the heterogeneity in this kind of first stage analysis, to get a sense of what types of farmers were any more or less likely to listen to these calls, which is going to tell us which farmers are driving whatever reduced form impacts you see. One other thing which isn't on these slides that I sent Ricardo is I would love to see heterogeneity by baseline knowledge. Since you have, we can just hold on this slide for one more second, Ricardo, before we go to the next one. You have the baseline knowledge score, and so theoretically, you should only be moving the needle you should be moving the needle probably more on knowledge for people who are less informed at baseline. And so you can do that heterogeneity fairly easily. And so showing us both heterogeneity in end-line knowledge and end-line behavior and outcomes by baseline knowledge would be really useful. So on to the last slide, Ricardo, and then I'll wrap up. I myself wouldn't worry too much about the speakerphone issue for the knowledge test. And I'm thinking of a sort of collective model of the household where decisions are made jointly, maybe not equally between household members, but so household knowledge may be just as important of a object to capture than individual knowledge. So I wouldn't be too worried about the fact that there might have been some collaboration going on during the knowledge stuff. On your attrition analysis, attrition is of course a challenge with phone survey. You talked about a rate of 14%. What you want to do is test whether that's balanced across treatment and control, and include that in the analysis. Last two things. And this, I think, Rashid mentioned something in the chat window which relates to this. But subsetting the data to only completed calls or controlling for SMFs, these kind of outcome related things that happen in the treatment group, that's not that you can't do that because those are outcomes, and so that's either subsetting the data based on an outcome or controlling on some kind of thing that happened only in the treatment group. Whether you want to rescale the ITT by the first stage to calculate a TOT is not 100% obvious, given that you have a cluster design and you potentially have information spillovers within villages. So that's something to be a bit cautious about. Nonetheless, if calculating the TOT is a single IV regression, where you're just more or less rescaling the reduced form by the first stage. So I had a bit of a hard time presenting or following what the presented TOT results were doing, to be honest. And then I think we can largely skip this last point, but I find it interesting to kind of know more about why, what was the big issue, why only 51% of the farmers were reached with the recorded messages. So the results I looked at suggested that the recorded messages weren't terribly ineffective, but those results have changed a little bit. But nonetheless, sort of telling us why that was, the reach of that was sufficiently less would be helpful. So that's it with -3 minutes to spare.
Thank you, Kyle. Should I respond to some of these comments? I think a lot of this is a lot for us to sort of think about and work. And like we said, these results are very preliminary, so we really welcome this sort of in-depth comments. We concur. I think we need to broaden our outcomes beyond just knowledge. We focused on knowledge because we were only covering one season, and this was an unusual season, right? Because adoption of these new technologies, as Smriti mentioned, could be guided by many other things other than just information constraints. So, you're looking at whether you have access to credit or not, whether you have access to the actual pesticides that you need or not, which was compromised due to closed borders with India during the lockdown. So there are a lot of other things in place. So one of the things we are planning to do, and we hope that we can do it at some point, is to go back to the field, if not to everyone, then, sort of a randomly selected subset of the entire sample, all two treatment arms and control, sometime in this year to see if any of these knowledge impacts have persisted, as well as whether we see sort of longer term impacts on adoption as well. Because we think one season is probably just too short of a time to see changes in adoption. But yeah, all of the other points, I think points are well taken, and we'll keep those in mind as we move forward with our analysis. Also, just to comment on sort of what the baseline, what is the information friction that we're trying to address? Because fall armyworm is such a new threat, we did a lot of qualitative field work over multiple sort of visits to this area. And we found that most farmers rely on agrovets, which are the agriculture input dealers, as their main source of information. And because this pest was so new, there was a big mismatch between what the agrovets were prescribing to address this pest and what was the recommended practice by the Nepal government task force. And so this worm doesn't respond to many of the more commonly used pesticides in that region. And so whatever their main source of information was clearly ineffective in addressing this threat. So that is a big information friction that we were addressing. I think over time, as the pest becomes more prevalent and agrovets sort of update the information about what works and what doesn't, I think the information friction would be reduced to some extent. But at the time, we were kind of working towards a threat that was absolutely emergent, and not very many people knew how to address it properly.
I think that's testable in the data in a way, because you have baseline knowledge source, and so where they're getting their information at baseline, you can look at heterogeneity according to that.
Yes, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we do have a whole module on access to ag extension, so we can capture those definitely.
Okay. I don't know if we have another question, a final question or comment to the presenters. If not, I would like to thank the both teams, the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT and IFPRI for the very good presentations, and also to Kyle and Rashid for the very important inputs and comments they provide as discussants. So thank you very much for coming to this meeting, and we look forward for the next SPIA webinar.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys.